key risks. Hello and warm welcome to this virtual live event discussing key risks in India for private investors in 2022 in partnership with IVCA. I'm Siddharth Gautam, Principal Business Intelligence South Asia with Control Risks, and I'll be your host for the next 60 minutes. Today's event is on the back of Control Risks Annual Risk Map 2022. It's a flagship forecast that captures global risks across the sectors. While the risk map covers global trends for business in general, it also underscores some of the potential key risks for private investors. Today, we will be focusing on some of the key risks for the private sectors and private investors in India. Before we start the event, let's do a quick round of introduction for our panel today. Let me start by introducing my colleague Pratyush Rao, who's Director and Head of Global Risk Analysis for South Asia. We have Kanchan Jain, MD and Head of India Credit at Baring PE Asia. We are also joined with Amit Jain, MD and Co-Head India at Carlyle Group, and Uday Garg, Managing Partner at Mandala Capital Funds. Let me now request Pratyush to set the stage for today's discussion by giving us a brief 10-minute presentation to understand the key risks in India for private investors in 2022. Pratyush, over to you.
Thank you, Sid, and a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us today for what should be a very interesting discussion. Shreya, if you can pull up the deck, that'll be great before I dive in. Yeah. Thank you. So as Sid mentioned, this discussion comes on the back of our global risk map rollout, which is really our annual forecast of business risks that we typically release at the start of each year. If we go on to the next slide, Shreya, all of you will see that this is essentially our top 5 risks. They do have a global remit and tend to be sector agnostic. So I would encourage some of you to kind of check our link below, which kind of will give you a sense of the kind of themes we typically cover in our risk map. But for the purposes of this specific presentation, I've tried to adapt them to an Indian context, especially as it relates to the investor community. And in terms of the key risks, I would like to flag 3 top risks this coming year. Next slide, Shreya. So the first risk is that political risk makes a comeback. You'll forgive us for highlighting this as a key risk theme this year, considering we've been working on political risk issues for more than 4 decades. But the main risk to investors really comes from a distracted polity, as politics and electioneering really takes center stage. For a lot of us who are in India, we are just gearing up for sort of the mother of all sort of state elections, especially with Uttar Pradesh coming up. But it's not just UP. 6 other states go to polls. 6 of the 7 states are currently governed by Prime Minister Modi's BJP. And there's really a lot at stake, not just because of the number of states up for grabs, the political weightage of some of those state elections, and the timing of those elections coming as it does just 2 years before the next general elections. So while, and in terms of what this means for policy, obviously, and that's kind of what we're really here to talk about, the investment climate, this is likely to have a ripple effect on both the pace and commitment that the government commits to reforms between now and 2024. There is likely to be heightened political contestation, both between the BJP and a number of other parties that are looking to shore up support between now and the next sort of 18 to 24 months. And we're really expecting the politics to kind of heat up, both at the inter-party level as well as the center state dynamics. There are a lot of other variables at play. Even now, with just 2 years to go, there's still no political challenger on the horizon. So it will have broader political significance. But I think one of the key things to kind of look out for over the next few weeks and months is really what this election does in terms of the priorities for the government, but equally for the broader sort of political surround sound around what issues get taken up. And then we are likely to see potentially, especially if these state elections result in a significant setback for the government, an increased temptation to kind of rely on political mobilization on some of the other sort of social themes, both as a way to rally support and which will potentially result in a limited political bandwidth to kind of garner support for some of its economic reforms. There are specific triggers that are on the horizon. We do have the state elections in Jammu and Kashmir coming up potentially later this year. J&K, as you know, was downgraded from a state to a union territory a couple of years back, and there's a significant degree of potential consequences that this election may have for the broader for the government's mandate, both to ensure that the elections take place in that region, but equally in terms of ensuring that it goes without any violence whatsoever. So there is a fair bit of distractions coming up on the horizon, and we do think this will have a significant consequence for what the government will be able to do over the next few months. Let's not also forget that this comes on the back of the rollback of the agricultural reforms, which really, while it a lot of people would argue made for great economic sense, the political messaging around it and the way it was kind of handled will have sort of consequences for what kind of comes up on the policy agenda. So overall, we see a potential downside risk for investor sentiment, both because of the distracted polity, but equally the ebbing sort of political resolve for some of the more contentious reforms. So I know, we've spoken about land reforms in the past. It's still stuck. There are other reforms on the horizon. So the LIC IPO is obviously up on the horizon as well. But in terms of what might actually get done, we might see there being a significant difference between what's stated and what actually gets done. So investors will need to carefully monitor what happens there. Moving on to the next risk, Shreya, thank you. Geopolitical churning spills over into 2022. And this is a really interesting one because we've seen quite a shift from the past where, unlike clients who were traditionally skeptical about geopolitical risks becoming a cause for concern, last year we surveyed about 350 of our global clients in late 2021, of which a staggering 66% of the respondents said that their organization was reevaluating their strategy based on evolving geopolitical undercurrents. So how is this really playing out in the Indian context? I think one of the areas that we'll see a continuing acceleration of is the localization of supply chains. We've seen the Indian government sort of PLI scheme, which is obviously a government incentive to make in India, to produce, manufacture in India. And some of those regulatory sort of pressures will likely continue. So there'll be a greater scrutiny of what companies do in terms of where they source their raw materials from. And that could potentially result in both scrutiny of their supply chains, but equally potentially shortages in areas like semiconductors, etc., which obviously where there's a global supply challenges at the moment. We do expect some of that to continue over the coming years. On the other side of the spectrum is obviously India's broader industrial and trade policy. I know there's been some conversations, and India has just sort of embarked on trade negotiations with countries like the UK, Australia, and the UAE. But I think it's important to be quite calibrate what would actually come of it. I think our assessment is that these are likely to be fairly low-hanging fruits in terms of what might come of it. I think the ambition that some of these trade deals might eventually result in would be fairly tempered. And I think one has to juxtapose what actually expectations versus reality. So we do expect to see the high tariffs on some of the raw materials to continue. And I think that will continue to kind of pose significant challenges across the supply chain. And this is primarily set in the context of obviously the US-China sort of trade dynamics that we currently see. But equally, I think on the tech side especially, I think the impact of the Sino-Indian border tensions, we think will continue to cast a shadow over the digital economy sphere. with potential for downstream regulatory action. And we've seen over the past sort of 18 months, we've supported clients who had to deal with issues around overcoming some of these sort of political and regulatory roadblocks, including circumventing sort of Press Note 3, which was the FDI screening rules that were put in place in April 2020. Add to that newer conflicts and tensions. I think, while we've not seen a significant amount of attention here in India on what's kind of going on in Ukraine, but I think it's worth keeping an eye on how that dynamics plays out in the next sort of 3 to 6 months. I think there is a medium likelihood that there could be potential gas supply disruptions to Europe, especially if tensions escalate and Russia cuts down gas supplies to the EU, which could potentially result in an oil shock globally with obvious impacts for the India's sort of economic recovery. And this could obviously force the private investor community to kind of go to sort of more safer assets like US government bonds. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind as well. Companies can mitigate some of these risks. We've seen over the past sort of 6 to 12 months, investee companies typically have adapted to some of these challenges, which like I said, are not new. They've been present over the past sort of 12 to 18 months by ensuring that they localize more of their supply chains, that they leverage some of the government incentives that are kind of flagged, including the PLI scheme, as well as kind of sourcing from safer markets to the extent that those raw materials are available there. And this could ensure that companies can mitigate some of those risks. For private equity players, I think it's worth ensuring that the invested companies have diversified sources for the supply materials, so that there's no shock that the supply chains sort of face. Finally, I think on this specific point, investors will need to monitor whether sort of even on the Ukraine crisis, I think India has a potential sort of fallout here for the investment play in India. India obviously has very close relations with both the US and Russia, and is currently seeking to acquire several major military platforms from the Russian government, including a $5 billion missile defense system, which could potentially expose companies to tertiary sanctions. We don't necessarily think that the US would target, and there will be broad-based sanctions against multiple sectors, but this is something to kind of keep a track on, especially if the situation intensifies, and if we get to a point where there's a real sort of possibility of sort of land-based conflict in Ukraine, and tensions between the US and Russia ratchet up. Finally, Shreya, if we can move on to the last slide. And this is really kind of coming back to domestic politics again, and sort of the regulatory net. I think this year will be the two things to broadly look out for, and two sort of risk themes that I would want to identify. One is obviously to see what happens on the back of sort of India's pledges and commitments that the Indian government made at the Conference of Parties summit at the UN last October. There was some very substantive commitments, but I think the key sort of variables to look out for is whether some of those commitments be backed by proper budgetary sort of commitments, whether the upcoming budget actually sets aside a proper money for investing in this space. And I think one of the things we could potentially expect is additional lines of sort of PLI schemes on areas related to green technology. So that's something to kind of look out for. But I think our fundamental assessment remains that the broader ESG regulation standards, where the EU has taken a lead in framing the regulations, still remains fairly underdeveloped and fragmented. So you're essentially looking at a fairly fragmented regulatory landscape. And this would potentially pose both compliance issues for companies. So while there will be a bit of a scramble for within the ESG domain within green tech, I think companies will have to be careful on the kind of deals that they pursue, especially given the fact that we're seeing dilution of some of the environmental impact assessment requirements in India, and even dilution of sort of public hearings that typically accompany that process to fast track some of the investments. So it does come with a potential reputational cost, and we've seen just over the past 6 months we've had clients coming to us and commissioning sort of in-depth sort of land rights assessment or community due diligences to ensure that there's no potential reputational fallout by way of when they kind of go after some of these potential deals. The last point I would make is on the tech side. I think there are a couple of big sort of regulatory developments on the anvil. I think the most prominent one is the data protection framework, which now potentially includes the non-personal data bits as well. And I think one of the key things to look out for is what sort of an enforcement mechanism it comes with. The legislation obviously has been delayed for quite some time, but I think it's fair to expect, given the JPC's recommendations, that it could potentially happen at long last in 2022. So one of the key things to look out for obviously is what it means for the enforcement side, what kind of powers the new data protection authority will kind of have, and what kind of punitive measures they could put against companies and individuals. So that's a key area to kind of look into, especially given the huge footprint of the fintech industry in India, but also given that there are new emerging, what I call sort of Wild West subsectors. We're seeing obviously the move around cryptocurrency, governments in Asia thinking about the regulatory landscape for the metaverse, and on all of those issues, India's sort of positioning is still, unclear, and it remains to be seen which direction India might kind of go on some of those issues. So while there will be opportunities for companies, I think companies will have to square against the potential for high policy unpredictability, including reversals in some of those areas. I think with that, I'll kind of stop, Sid. I think I'll open it up to, I'll get you to take it from here.
Thanks, Pratyush. Thank you. That was really, really insightful, and of course, a very detailed presentation. Okay, let me now straight away start the panel discussion without any further ado. If I may come to you, Uday, I would imagine that you would sort of relate to some of the points made by Pratyush in his presentation, specifically around the regulatory risks that can cause a potential disruption for private investors. I mean, Mandala is very active in agribusiness. What bothers you the most? Do you think farm laws directly or indirectly impacted you as an investor and your point of view in India?
Yeah, so as you said, we only focus in the food and agri space in the region, so my perspective might be slightly different. I think broadly, maybe I'll break it into two main points. From a very macro perspective, I think the risk is just that on a relative basis, India's growth is less attractive than other places. And, that's all that kind of matters from a very macro space. And at the moment, our growth is outperforming other major economies and has been for a long time. And that's been the story. And as long as nothing derails that, all this other stuff is just a bit of noise, and investors will still remain attracted to the space. And then on the second point, maybe moving specifically to the food and agri space. Again, I think I'll avoid some of the obvious answers. Maybe one of the trends that we've seen recently is a lot of money is being diverted to the tech space, or the agri-tech space in particular. And my fear is that there is a lot of money chasing that side of it rather than the traditional food and agri side. And, it's going to land up burning a lot of investors, and they'll get put off by the space. And for me, that's really a concern. And the way sort of valuations are in the space and the amount of capital just chasing tech in my sector means that, there's, I'd say, majority of the capital in my space is going towards agri-tech instead of more traditional agri. And so that's a risk for us, if I think of a 10-year view on what's going to happen in my sector.
Let me ask you another question on it. what's making you so nervous about the tech? Do you think we are not getting the tech right? Or do you think we are still not there when it comes to technology? Because I mean, edutech has seen a severe rise. Even if you look at the pandemic, in last 2 years, edtech sector is something that has seen a steep rise.
Yeah.
What's going wrong in your opinion? What's making you nervous as far as agri-tech is concerned?
Well, there's a lot of things. I think tech as a concept is great. I mean, and everyone needs to adapt and get technology into their businesses and all of that. But I think the money that's going into tech is more into very speculative tech, where actually there might not be any technology behind it. So just an online platform doesn't necessarily or claiming AI or claiming data analytics is not necessarily going to make any difference. I think more specifically, I don't think there's that much depth in the market. So there's more money chasing very few deals. I don't think there's a lot of exit opportunities in the market in my space. I think the valuations are very high, and there's business models are not really making any money in my space. And those are all pretty big sort of red flags. And there's a lot of tech happening in more traditional businesses, which I think are, where we're more excited about. But they're not marketed as pure tech or pure AI, and they don't have the sort of buzzwords maybe around them. And those businesses are much more stable and profitable. And I feel, the risk is that all the money goes into businesses that might never make any money.
That's interesting. So not much depth, high valuation, of course. And of course, you guys are chasing more traditional space. Great, thanks right. For that. Amit, let me come to you now. Of course, as you know, the risk landscape in India and South Asia is undoubtedly unique. While some of the key risks are, of course, cyber, reputational, and security. And of course, some of these are also relevant to the Indian market. But let me ask, in your experience, having invested in this market across sectors, what's the most pertinent risk that you would underscore, or something that really stands out for you as an investor in India?
I think Pratish covered quite a bit around the macro, and I think they're all very valid points. But the one way to think about this is, I don't know if you play poker, but those are the cards dealt to you, right? I think it's an environment we operate in, and arguably this is an emerging market. But the reality of today's global environment, when some of the risks which Pratish talked about, from cybersecurity to the environment issues to geopolitical tensions, they are almost global risk. Every country is going through it, whether it's the US or the Europe or China or India. So I don't think, I would particularly be concerned sitting in India as an Indian investor of those type of risk, not to kind of minimize those, but as I said, that's the way I think about or characterize some of those risks. Is it's an environment we are operating in, and one has to be very savvy and aware of that. I think what worries us is, and at Carlyle, we are very micro investors. And I think when I double click on the micro, slightly deviating from the topic at hand, but few things worry us. A few things we kind of think about when we chase new deals or seek new opportunities. Number one is valuation. I think Uday spoke about it. I think it's just not tech. The reality is we are kind of trading at all-time high multiples, if not, very near all-time high multiples, depending on what base effect you consider, right? India was a country from a private equity standpoint, which is considered very easy to deploy, but tough to get money out. Last 3 years has reversed it. A lot of successful exits at Carlyle for our industry, firms, and therefore the amount of excitement which we see for India in private markets and in public markets is probably at unprecedented levels in the environment we are in. Maybe China softening is further, helping the cause for India, but the valuations are kind of unprecedented. Because one way to phrase this is for the environment which Pratish just laid out, right, where there's just so many risks across dimensions. You would think the discount rate should be very high, but at the same time the valuations are so high, and you could argue and you could explain it with low interest rates, liquidity, but all said and done the valuations are very high, and one needs to be very cognizant. So to me, as a private micro investor, that worries me. I think the second word I would say is what I call as delusion of denominator, right? Today, when you are talking of a multiple on a business, whether it's PE, EBITDA, revenue, whatever it is, either that business is a beneficiary of COVID or has got impacted because of COVID. So the reported financials are somewhat not the starting point. I've never seen the amount of adjustments, rightly so, done on the base on which some multiple has to be applied, right? So the denominator is almost disillusionary, right? I mean, the businesses you're looking at where they're saying, oh, my EBITDA is, let's say, 100, but it should be 140 because 2 quarters I was just shut. On the other hand, there are some tech businesses which have got so massively benefited in this wave that one is thinking that maybe if COVID is not there and the world is a bit more offline, that 100 should be more 80. So across the board, you're kind of almost reinventing the denominator on which you need to put the EBITDA. And that's a very big micro risk, because if you get the denominator wrong, what we call as the sustainable performance, the starting point for the deal would go haywire. And I think the final one, again, kind of related to Uday's point, we as private investors take a lot of pride in the diligence we do, and we tend to do a great job of it. But the market has become very difficult because one of the core questions we ask in a micro diligence is, what's the moat in the business, right? It's a very often question asked by the partner to the analyst on the deal, that what's the real moat? Which the corollary of that is, what's the real entry barrier, right? If you go back to the Porter's 5 forces, you're trying to analyze all of it. This is an environment, because of the availability of capital, right? It's kind of difficult to see that how much capital can actually break an entry barrier, right? And could there be a provider of capital from the new age or the old age, which will put that money behind the work, right? Despite not starting with a great point of strength or moat, but break into a market with the size of capital. Because the underlying, I mean, I never spoke to Mr. Porter, but his view may be that everybody wants to make profitable businesses, right? On day one, right? Yes. And therefore comes the moat, and therefore comes the entry barrier. But if you break that fundamental premise that, fine, I'm happy to invest or bleed for a period of time for future, then I'm not sure. And I think to that extent, when we look at now businesses, it's very important for us to really figure out, will this moat sustain against the fight of capital, right? Against abundance of capital. And that's a very tough question in all transparency. So I guess valuation, what denominator you're trying to go for, and what are the real moats in a market where there can be capital just trying to break those entry barriers, are some of the micro risk, which I worry about. I'll pause.
Sure. Before I go to Kanchan, I have one more question for you. I think it's coming from the word that you use. I think diligence is extremely important for any investor in India, be it a smaller investor or a bigger investor, doesn't really matter. But when it comes to diligence, of course, every deal goes through a cycle of diligence, be it legal, tax, integrity. There is a proper cycle that follows. In your opinion, Amit, and in your experience, how much do you rely on doing a proper, thorough integrity background check of the promoters? I mean, EBITDA could be really looking really good, and everything would be fine. But say suppose legal DD throws up, of course, a negative sort of a report at you, and a consultant like control risk would come and say, as far as the integrity of the promoters is concerned, we know they're politically exposed, we know they're cooking up their books, etc. Where do you stand there? I mean, how much reliance there is on when it comes to diligence, especially the integrity of the promoter and of course the business?
Oh, I think, suffice to say, and I think it's probably true for everybody, but definitely at Carlyle, there's no starting point on any gray line, right? For 2 reasons. One, life is too short. And 2, there are just tons of opportunity. That's the reality of it, right? I think 10, 15 years back when there was only models around partnership, and I guess that probably brings to the core of creating value in India. I mean, I often tell my team there's demand for everything in India, right? The real rubber hits the road in terms of profitably executing a business model, right? To capture the profit pools in that segment, right? As Uday spoke about, maybe there's enough revenue pool in every sector, but the way some of those go-to-market models are, probably the profitability is just not there in these models. And where I'm going with this is, the only way to get that right is get the right partners. Now, those right partners could be national champions in some cases entrepreneurs, some cases management teams, right? And I think private equity firms have to get that model right. There's literally no starting point for a doubt in the integrity or the quality of the promoters.
Spot on. And I think getting the right partner is the only answer. Of course, sometimes it's very difficult to get, but we have seen multiple situations where actually deals have gone south even though EBITDA was looking really good because they just didn't trust the promoters and what the integrity report really threw up. Kanchan, you lead the credit segment for Baring Asia. What are the key risks for the credit business in India for private investors like you? And do you think, when it comes to the credit business, are you guys being appreciated well enough? And what are your expectations?
I think the key risks for us really, I mean, at the micro level, at the company level, are the kind of risks you normally look at, right? Which is, are the cash flows going to be enough? Is the business going to sustain? What's the downside risk of the business? And, can whatever debt that we're working with on that EBITDA, can that be serviced, right? I mean, it all sort of boils down to that because, we are a cash flow based investor. We are very clearly performing credit operating accruals based investor. I think what we are looking at more closely is just the overall risk. I agree with Amit a little bit that I think all of the risks that Pratyushu talked about are very important and something that all investors and companies need to be aware of, but that's the given backdrop. I think if you look at the Indian market today, I would say a couple of things that are top of the mind for us is one, just overall inflation, starting with, just an elongated supply chain disruption. If that doesn't get corrected, for a period of time, it affects businesses. We've seen that on the ground, freight cost, and people have had to modify their contracts, to basically very, very clearly say freight's not on my account. There have been some real changes people have done. Inflation, given the oil price. And I think a big risk in our mind is just a loss of manufacturing jobs, right? I mean, we've seen 10 odd million worth of job loss that have happened. Some got absorbed in agriculture when, the sowing season was there. The services jobs got absorbed, but more in personal services, not in business services. Clearly, the purchasing power is very different because that has a link into our whole consumption story, growth story. Those are the key risks. In the context of whatever is happening globally, we actually think there are very big opportunities for Asia, for India, for South Asia, which is all of the China plus one, digitization, decarbonization are big opportunities for massive manufacturing bases to get created in India and in other geographies like Philippines and Vietnam. And there are sectors like textiles and chemicals which have already started to see the benefit of that. So for credit markets, I think that's a big plus. What drives private credit and non-bank credit is disintermediation of bank credit, which is happening in India, which is happening in Asia, secular trends that have been in place for 20 years in the US. I think as an asset class is, it's getting there. There's still some way to go.
Okay, let me just ask another added question here. Where does India stand in relation to its peers in Asia as the investment destination this year? And you did touch upon it. What are the key driving factors for us in India? That will really attract the interest of the investors. How do you compare some of these markets? Be it Philippines or Vietnam. How do you think that landscape has changed, especially after the pandemic?
I think it's set. I would say it's set par. There is a lot of interest. We are, a large economy that's growing at 7% plus or whatever, wherever you peg that, depending on what time you look at it. So that interest is very much there. There is growing interest because of these trends of China plus one. I do think we have to get a lot of our things right in terms of getting that, being a solid investment destination. The usual questions that people talk about, which is regulations, now a little bit of political uncertainty, concern around governance, given the strength of the ruling party and lack of an opposition. I think, these are some very real issues that come in the way. But it's a strong investment destination nonetheless. There is a lot of interest in the country from offshore investors.
Do you think there is ease of business doing in India? Do you think it's easy sort of a landscape for anybody to come in and start doing the business?
I think it's improved in pockets. Certain pockets have really done well. It's improved. We see, and we are sometimes pleasantly surprised with that. But there are still a lot of areas which I'm sure, other panelists will agree where, you tear your hair out because it takes time to get things resolved. Maybe that's emerging markets, but there's still some progress made, some way still to go.
Still way to go. Okay, let me now bring in Pratyush here. Pratyush, You have supported and advised multiple private investors over the years. Where do you think, or do you understand, when we talk about geopolitical landscape, and in some cases, the performance of certain upcoming sectors, and you have been on and off received these requests from various clients to say, can you please help us understand the geopolitical landscape and how the sectors are doing? Can you share your experience and the value that control risks added to those potential leads?
Yeah, sure, Sid. So I think on the geopolitical stuff, I think it's definitely been a theme that's been of huge interest to some of our private equity clients, in the way that it hasn't been before sort of 2020, and for the reasons that I mentioned in my presentation. I think that the localization of supply chains, the fact that, especially in the tech sector, there's obviously regulatory enforcement has stemmed partly from overarching sort of geopolitical undercurrents, especially in the aftermath of the China-India border tensions. I think there's definitely a lot of interest in terms of how some of those investment rules might play out on the FDI screening bits, for instance, around Press Note 3. A lot of investors route investments through Hong Kong and Singapore, and I think there was a fair bit of a lot of uncertainty around whether even some of those investments would be targeted. And I think so we did have to kind of look into where the investment was coming in from, and what some of the potential exposure could be. I think in terms of sort of sectors, I would definitely kind of call out on the data center sector as one of a very interesting sectors that I worked on over the past sort of 6 months. We've had 3 requests in the last year, for sort of market entry assessments around establishing data centers. So that includes not just looking at the broader regulatory and political landscape in terms of federal incentives, etc., but even sort of state level dynamics. So looking at factors like the operational risks on the ground, land rights issues, to sort of environmental issues around setting up a data center in a particular jurisdiction, but equally looking at things like wastage, infrastructure, because obviously data centers have to be set up in very specific areas where the water supply, power supply is really on par. So we've done a fair bit of work on that. And obviously with the data privacy bill coming up, it seems like that interest is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. So that's something sort of worth we're very excited about. And the last one is kind of on the regulatory part, right? So we've had a few cases where private equity players who invested in the online gaming space have come to us and asked us about sort of the state level uncertainty, right? You have different states who take a different interpretation of what constitutes a game of skill and what constitutes a game of chance, which is currently what the framework is to determine whether a particular game is legal or not. So a lot of in-house general counsels have asked us those questions, and obviously that does have significant sort of implications in terms of both the ability to kind of grow the business, but equally, in a couple of instances we've had prosecution risks, very specific legal risks stem out of it. We had a client whose local India directors got arrested because got detained, and we were asked to come in and provide sort of advisory because it kind of fell through those regulatory cracks. So yeah, that's just to give you sort of a flavor of some of the issues I've supported clients on.
But what about the renewables sector, Pratyush? I know for a fact that you did a lot of work in that sector. How did that pan out?
So on renewables, we're getting a lot of interest, and I think some of that is not surprising given obviously India's sort of commitments. I think a lot of the questions have been, so currently India's sort of framework is more in terms of obviously adding additional renewable capacity, but I think not a lot of work has been done, and there's not a lot of clarity on whether the grids would be modernized, because I think that's kind of where some of the challenges lie. So you currently have, even with the power purchase agreements, there have been a number of instances, especially during the pandemic, where discoms, which were not doing very well, had to renege on contracts, could not honor the contracts they entered into, and so those have been the kind of issues I worked on. So contract risk, non-payment sort of issues, debt profiles of different sort of discoms. and the uptake, in terms of whether India can add additional renewable capacity to the national grid. So those have been kind of the broader structural questions. So in addition to your typical sort of due diligence into sort of promoters and investing companies, I think we kind of looked into some of those broader capacity issues, regulatory sort of dynamics, which made it fairly interesting as well.
Interesting. And I think risks and opportunities go hand in hand. Today, I think while so far we have discussed some of the risks, let's now switch gears and touch upon some of the key opportunities for the private investors in the coming years, especially in India. I'll start with Amit. I think, Amit, it'll be unfair to call it the post-pandemic era already, as the pandemic is still evolving and unfolding. And we don't know what will hit us next, wave 3, wave 4, wave 5, and what new variants sort of come and sort of affect the EBITDA and certainly investors and their plans. In this context, how are you doing? How is Carlyle doing in terms of their investments in the last 2 years since the pandemic started? And what are the key sectors that you think will continue to see uptake and, of course, interest from Carlyle in India?
Yeah, I think we, I was thinking about it when you asked Kanchan about, where does India stand, and without necessarily getting into a comparison with other economies, I think on an absolute basis, if we look at it, right, one of the things which is very strong about India is it's a very decoupled economy. I mean, 60 to 65% of our GDP comes from domestic consumption. You look at an environment where, if we kind of are, I mean, in nice or not so good manner, we are pretty insulated from global impacts, right? So if you think about it, and we are fast growing, we're the largest fast growing economy. So if you want to play growth and you want to play in a fairly insulated manner, it provides for a great diversification for any global investor who is otherwise playing on some of the global themes. So I think India has its own sweet spot in terms of attracting that pool of capital which wants to play on the domestic consumption. And I think across the themes of domestic consumption, whether it's increasing financial services penetration to consumer businesses, you will see us transact. I guess the other leg of it, where I would say, you could call it post-pandemic or, just a turn of events, India is now very uniquely positioned, right, which is the export sector. And there are two legs to it. One, I think our home ground, which is Indian IT services, right? More than 50% of the global outsourcing on IT and IT-enabled services are coming to India. And post-pandemic, if you may, or post-COVID, the wave around digitization, right? I mean, our CEO says every business is a tech business, every deal is a tech deal, right? If you take that narrative, the mandate of these companies out of India has changed from service maintenance to fundamentally driving business transformation, enabling business outcomes. And therefore, the work has changed from, maintaining IT frames to system implementations to actually cybersecurity, data analytics, AI, ML, a lot of work to do, but you're starting to see that traction in that part of the pocket. India has very unique advantages driven out of the intrinsic talent we have in that sector. So huge opportunity, and you'll see Carlyle leaning forward in terms of evaluating assets and seeking opportunities into that space. I think the second one is, I think Kanchan spoke about it. Supply chains are getting restructured, right, globally, for a variety of reasons. There is a China plus one strategy. There is a strategy around, being nationally dependent on, critical sectors. So you will see CapEx investment for both domestic consumptions and for businesses where there is an export opportunity in the core manufacturing and advanced manufacturing, which will again require value-added capital, from private equity. So I guess domestic consumption, which is always our mainstay, but coupled with a lot of opportunities in Indian IT services and export-oriented manufacturing.
Interesting. Sounds good. Uday, do you agree completely with Amit, or do you have a different point of view when it comes to Mandala? How the last 2 years were for you, and do you think the focus for the next year or next 2 years will change, or are you still going to focus on agri very much and sort of look to invest in more traditional agri space?
Yeah. So I can't comment on some of the other sectors maybe as much as Amit. So I'll tell you what's happening in our space, which is quite interesting during the pandemic and I think pre and post. So in some ways, inflation has been relatively good for our space. So commodities have been on a massive deflationary trend for about 8 years. And there's an interesting sort of chart where you can look at the GSCI Goldman Sachs Commodity Index against the S&P globally. And, it's hit all-time lows sort of as a relative basis before it just turned about 6 months ago and sort of really made a big rally. And there's other linkages that are quite interesting for another conversation. But inflation has been really good because for a lot of the midstream companies in our space, it just means, maybe the margins are the same, but it just means more revenue, more EBITDA. And in companies in India, which usually have quite a lot of debt, that's usually quite helpful in solving a lot of issues. So that's been one area that's been good. The second area is, to Amit's point, and I think on the insulated part, Indian agri is, take what Amit said times 10. So, and this has been my message to a lot of investors who want to play global agri. And, I put out a lot of stuff about people investing in farmland in Brazil and all of that stuff. And, it's all a China play. But when you invest in India, you're getting the biggest sort of agri play in the world, entirely dependent on India. Our exports are really, insignificant compared to the scope we have just in consumer demand. And that's been super exciting. That trend has continued. And the COVID has not really affected, demand on food for sure. In fact, I think some of the other trends, so maybe I could talk about this a lot, so maybe I'll cut it short. And, there's been some trends that have emerged during COVID. So health and nutrition has been a big theme. People are a lot more conscious about what they eat, even in sort of rural areas. And then, source where your food is coming from has been a big thing. And in some ways, I don't know if this is the right analogy, but, sort of how India has made a big jump, say, on the telco side and moved, some places moved straight into wireless and never had fixed line. I think India, from a food trend standpoint, has moved quite quickly from, dal chawal to basically sort of, bajra roti and whatever, right? Like sort of more modern age, what we think would be more urban consumption is now happening nationwide. So, again, this is very specific to my space, but I think the opportunities are tremendous. And then maybe finally, we're seeing also more traditional family-owned businesses, which is what really is dominated in my space, transforming, getting more tech-enabled, launching new products, more innovation in their product line. Yeah, so it's a very exciting space. And I think, COVID for us has not really been that sort of dramatic in overall change of strategy. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
No, interesting. I think I completely connect with you when it comes to the food habits, especially after the COVID. I'm one of those who completely switched from eating, junk that I used to, and of course, focused more on the traditional food because, of course, now everybody is saying that, farm to plate is the new buzzword. And we saw some of the new players also coming in and actually saying that we are connecting farmers straight away, getting the food to your table and to your plate. So that's really, really interesting point of view.
Maybe there's one, I think this would be, sorry to interrupt, but this would be quite interesting for people, just a random, there's some peculiar things about Indian consumer habits because of COVID that you don't find elsewhere. So during COVID, ice cream consumption in most countries went up because people were eating a lot more ice cream because they're sitting at home all the time. But in India, it dropped significantly because people thought they'd get sick if they ate ice cream. And so if you're an ice cream company during COVID, you really suffered. And it's just interesting. So, very unique in the Indian context. And I can go through, many different subsectors in food that have reacted this way. But, I find sort of people find these anecdotes sort of the most interesting rather than us talking sometimes about the macro situation. So there you go.
That certainly calls for another discussion just to sort of understand the food habits, how it has evolved post-pandemic. Now, before we sort of move forward and sort of move towards the closing of this panel discussion, let me bring in some questions from the audience for our panel. Okay, the first question is, as a founder, how do you justify overvaluation of the firm? I know we don't have the founder on this panel, but perhaps, Amit, Do you want to take this one? I mean, I know, you passionately talked about how overvaluations are, of course, killing the market, and how it's sort of creating a disruption. I mean, what's your answer to this question of one of our audiences?
I think it's, if you go to history, the beauty lies in the eyes of beholder. So I guess, and rightly so, a lot of founders genuinely see through, right? Credit to them on how the world will unfold, right? I think it's our ability or inability or, sector expertise, sophistication on the investor's part to either see through, the conviction and back that conviction, or just very prudently, humbly kind of say that, look, it may come out true and I don't understand it, but I guess this FOMO, the fear of missing out, that there's like this mega trend which I don't understand, but I should play. I think that's where, you may get tempted for overvaluation, because I genuinely don't think there's no overvaluation, because there is a buyer in the market and nobody's putting gun to the head for anybody to buy. I think it's your lack of ability to appreciate on why somebody's trying to value what they're trying to value that at, coupled with obviously the market cycle. So I think humility is very important, just to say that, look, I will not invest, back to basics, what I don't understand, just because the world seems to be making a lot of money out of. Even if I turn out to be wake up one day and think that, look, Uday has made a lot of money out of, investing in agri, and I just jump on the next agri deal without realizing the nuances of what it means to operate an agri business, likely I would burn my fingers, and then I would say, look, I just bought it expensive, it was overvalued, without realizing that, I just didn't appreciate the business. So I think it's less overvaluation. It's very complicated business model in a very evolving space, and one needs to just kind of sharpen the diligence and ask the right questions, and then back where you have convictions.
Okay, thank you. And I hope the audience who asked this question got the answer. Second question is around the political risk in edutech sector. Pratyush, I know you have advised private investors in ESG and renewable space as well, but let me just touch upon the edtech industry. What's your view about the political risk in this space?
I think off the bat, I would just say that this is one of the most regulated sort of sectors out there. If you see both sort of the schooling, the curriculums, even sort of higher education, you have specific organizations that have oversight of the sector, and obviously what kind of curriculum comes and how it's administered, etc. And I know over the past few years, a lot of the growth we've seen has been more around sort of, areas like test preparation, sort of school learning, continued learning. And I do think there'll be a more concerted attempt over the coming months to regulate parts of that hitherto unregulated sort of spaces. So I do think the regulatory sort of clutches would kind of increase, I think, over the coming months, and there will be a greater temptation to regulate parts of the sector which has not been regulated. And I think the Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan has also made comments to that regard, saying there'll be an interministerial sort of committee which comprising the Law Ministry, METI, and the Education Ministry to look into how to regulate edutech. So maybe that's something to keep an eye on.
Yeah. I mean, of course. I mean, it's something that will really require a lot of time, effort, and of course, a concerted sort of an effort to sort of regulate them, because it's technology in itself is not a very easy, sector to sort of regulate. We hope for the best. Now, the third question is, what is the outlook for the financial services, especially MSME lending? Kanchan, do you want to share your views on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, fundamentally in the whole, prospects of financial services rest on one single thing, that we are underprovided for in terms of capital. If you look at just where Indian corporate sector debt is as a percentage of GDP, we're one of the lowest. In emerging markets, across developed markets, we're at about 50% of our GDP, whereas the rest of the world is 100% plus, and 170, 180% is where the developed world averages. There is just a significant shortage there. Within that, I think the shortage is predominantly there in the mid-market sector, in the SME sector, and MSME sector. I think we combine this with the fact that, one, we are a very large economy that's growing at 7% plus. Two, we are fundamentally a private sector economy, right? Compared to some of the other large economies which have a sort of dominance of state-owned enterprises, India is much more a private sector enterprise, no matter which sector you look at. And I think you take those two, and I think that just creates a tremendous opportunity for lending to this sector, providing capital for growth. Whether you do it via NBFCs, you do it via funds, you do it, using the whole fintech sector and, using technology. I think all of those business models, there's, just tremendous opportunity. The other thing I think that has happened in the last 20 years is the role debt has played in growth, right? I mean, at one level, we've seen too much Gretzky in places like China, which is now over leveraged. But I think in places like India, there is a significant role, that debt can play. Private sector enterprises and owners means that they're often looking for non-dilutive capital. So you put all of those together in the mix, right? Private sector's non-dilutive capital, more structured capital means, non-bank lending, whether through NBFCs, whether through, PE sponsors investing in financial services or funds. When we've not even seen it's the tip of the iceberg right now. It's probably a $4-5 billion industry in India, and it could probably be close to $100 billion or so. I think it has tremendous potential from here on.
Before I move on, I also want to sort of ask you, Kanchan, in terms of your investments in the coming years, where are you placing your bets, and how was the last 2 years for you as an investor?
Well, the last 2 years
any
for
favorite
us,
sector that you have, or anything that you're really looking forward to invest?
Okay, I think the last two sectors for us have actually been very positive. We've actually, through very choppy credit markets, delivered, significant exits and high double-digit return to our investors. I think in some ways the choppy credit markets allows, a differentiation between managers, which doesn't happen when there is sort of ample liquidity in the market. I think our favorite sweet spot is the mid-market. We see that as significantly underpenetrated. And the interesting thing is, when we say there is tremendous potential, there's scalability that can happen in Indian debt markets. For a player that plays in now, you can be highly selective, right? So if you just do like for like, we invest in companies that are like not more than 3 times leveraged as a debt over EBITDA. And we are generating those returns because you're providing debt solutions that do not come through the regular banking sector. It's a question mark for a lot of people still in India to say, why is a company paying that much? But I think the relative returns in Indian private debt market are way better than what you get, internationally, definitely, but also in rest of Asia. What are the sectors we look at? I think it's, back to basic lending, good track record, repayment and execution track record, solid, sort of growth prospects and strong cash flows. A lot of the new age sectors we sort of rule out because of that. But I think a simple premise is wherever the incremental ROC of the business is strong and attractive, a sort of a structured debt solution makes a lot of sense, right? And I think that it's sort of what boils down to. So a number of chemical companies which are benefiting from this, setting up capacities, and I think partly what Uday said, you sort of jump the hoop, right? You don't go through the tradition, you're straight away setting up new capacities that are ESG compliant, that are on the right sort of spectrum when it comes to decarbonization. And if you're providing capital, these are actually great value propositions. So traditional economy sectors and performing cash flow generating businesses.
Thank you. My fourth and perhaps the last question from the audience is for you, Uday. Are investors interested in recycling sector in India?
Yeah, I mean, yes, they are, but recycling sector is also quite broad. So I would say, I think, okay, maybe I'll give one type of answer to this. I think there are some people that want to look at reducing wastage in the country. So you can say those are impact type investors, and that space is quite big. So you have, and reducing wastage can be done. So we own a cold chain business that's reducing wastage. They can be people who take actual waste and produce something with it. That's another type. So wastage, recycling is one, reducing food wastage type of business is another. And then there is more of general recycling, like recycling plastics and things like that, which I think is a different type of investor, more industrial investor. And I think that would fall maybe more under like Amit's sort of category, where he would look at it, and it's not really in my space. And I think that, yeah, that's a different sector. So, but of course, I think I don't think it's a sector standalone where you're seeing investors say, I really want to be in that space. So I think food and agri is a sector, but this is just, part of a generalist pool, I think. Nothing exciting to say, unfortunately, on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And actually, that really brings us to the close of this session today. I thanks each one of you to sort of take out time and help us understand some of these complex issues. And we hope that FY 2022 is sort of similar to what we saw in 2021, which was, of course, very hectic for all the private investors. We know for a fact that there were more than 1,500 deals with over $42 billion raised by the starters. We know, we exceeded sort of expectations. And we hope that this trend sort of continues. India as a destination will, of course, remain favored. That was the key point that I'm taking away from this session today. And we look forward to all the investments and opportunities here in India. Thank you very much, and stay safe, stay happy, and looking forward to having this conversation with all of you sometime soon, maybe in a better environment, face to face and not virtual. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.